9 seconds of complete, unbroken silence is an eternity in politics, and that is precisely how long the most supposedly fluent, media-savvy woman in the United States Congress sat completely paralyzed in front of a live microphone, with absolutely nothing coming out of her mouth. To truly comprehend the gravity of how she maneuvered herself into that inescapable corner, one must meticulously dissect the 40 minutes of high-stakes political theater that preceded it. When she first walked into that hearing room, she executed her entrance the way she always did, with an air of unbothered invincibility, projecting an aura that the proceedings were merely a trivial formality and that she had already secured her inevitable victory. Every movement was a calculated piece of optical dominance. She set her folder down with authority, deliberately tilted the heavy microphone toward her face by a perfectly practiced inch, and unhurriedly poured her water, setting the glass down with the exact, slow, deliberate precision of a person desperately wanting the room to observe just how remarkably unafraid she was. When the committee chairman finally granted her the floor for her opening statement, she seized the moment not as a defensive witness, but as a prosecutor delivering the final, definitive word in a grueling argument she felt she had been waging against the entire nation for 6 long years. She preemptively struck, declaring that she needed to speak her mind before the committee even pretended it possessed the moral or legal standing to question her, asserting confidently that she knew exactly what this spectacle was designed to achieve. She stared down the panel, claiming that there were multitudes of Americans watching from home who believed this hearing would finally teach her a lesson, people who had ostensibly made up their minds about her character the very day they first saw her name printed in the news. Her voice dripped with practiced disdain as she accused her detractors of using a terrible morning from nearly 25 years ago as a permanent, unwinnable argument. A perpetual trump card, they believed, granted them eternal victory without ever having to learn a single new objective fact. As those words echoed off the wood-paneled walls, a palpable, icy sound moved through the gallery, not quite a gasp, but a visceral, chilling reaction to her callous framing. Unfazed, a thin, almost triumphant smile crept across her face, as she boldly declared that she was entirely unwilling to perform any mandatory public grief for her critics. Nor would she ever flinch just because someone aggressively waved an American flag in her face in an attempt to intimidate her into submission. Framing the ideological battlefield, she proudly proclaimed herself as the undeniable future of the country, while actively reducing the lawmakers sitting directly across from her to mere representatives of a dying, fearful past, concluding with a smug warning not to confuse a legal subpoena with an equal conversation. Leaning back in her heavy leather chair, she looked immensely satisfied, fully believing her rhetorical strike had landed a devastating blow. And it certainly had landed, though perhaps not at all in the way she had so confidently anticipated. For anyone watching who has ever been aggressively silenced or told they are fundamentally unallowed to ask difficult, necessary questions simply because of a historical tragedy that shattered their family, her next moments would be crucial to watch because she had just deliberately categorized profound national grief as a cheap political weapon, and she had done it on camera, totally on purpose, with absolute conviction. Directly across from her, sitting at the witness table as an invited expert, conservative commentator Ben Shapiro did not so much as twitch for a full second, displaying the lethal, hyper-focused stillness of a man who makes his living dismantling arguments, and who fundamentally understands that the most devastating tactical maneuver in a tense room is to simply wait one extra agonizing heartbeat. 2 remarkably thin, meticulously organized folders sat perfectly squared in front of him, with a single, crucial sheet of paper clipped securely to the top. He stared at her intently over the expanse of the table, leaning deliberately into the microphone. And when he finally launched his counter-offensive, he accelerated instantly to his trademark breakneck speed. There was no polite warm-up, no nervous throat-clearing. His words were already operating at maximum velocity by the second syllable, as he sharply suggested they bypass the theatrical portion of the hearing, where they pretended that raw feelings equated to empirical evidence. He systematically dismantled her opening monologue, noting that while she relied heavily on emotional mood, words like fear and references to the past, he was not seated there to entertain her fluctuating moods. Instead, he brought the one thing a politician fears most: a verified transcript, He hammered home the reality that he was not presenting a loose paraphrase or a subjective vibe, but rather a rigid transcript complete with precise timestamps, detailing exact phrases she had spoken into hot microphones on specific dates, directly in front of credentialed individuals who meticulously recorded them. He announced his intention to methodically proceed through her statements in strict chronological order, sharply noting that the inherent beauty of a timestamp is its utter indifference to the emotional temperature of the room. Smoothing the single clipped sheet flat against the varnished table, he informed her that his line of questioning would consist solely of small, highly specific inquiries designed to extract actual, definitive answers. He bluntly requested that she strongly resist her ingrained political reflex to deflect and answer a completely different, unasked question simply because it was the response she had rehearsed. When she defensively snapped back that she did not require or accept instructions on how to speak, citing her successful electoral track record, Shapiro effortlessly parried the remark, cheerfully agreeing that while she had certainly mastered the art of talking, the room was about to witness how she handled the entirely different, far more demanding intellectual muscle required for actually answering. A smattering of nervous laughter momentarily broke the tension in the gallery before quickly suppressing itself into an uncomfortable silence, as the crowd realized the gravity of the impending confrontation. Refraining from reaching for the thicker, more ominous folders right away, Shapiro strategically opened his interrogation with an inquiry so seemingly minor and almost boring that it was delivered entirely without heat. A clinical approach that somehow felt significantly more menacing than outright aggression. He smoothly asked her to define her own rhetorical style. Did she consider herself a precise, careful author of her own words, or did she view herself as an impassioned speaker who spoke freely from the heart, letting her sentences land haphazardly where they may? Unable to resist a question that so plainly flattered her own self-image, the Congresswoman proudly declared that she always says exactly what she means, pointedly adding that she does not cowardly poll test her own conscience like the rest of the cynical politicians occupying the Capitol building. She boldly proclaimed that if her unvarnished honesty transformed her into a political target, she welcomed the hostility, asserting she would vastly prefer being despised for her authentic truth than adored for a convenient lie. Shapiro pounced on this admission with ruthless efficiency, immediately requesting the record reflect her enthusiastic confirmation that she picks her words carefully, is never a helpless victim of her own phrasing, and proudly considers herself the deliberate author of her own sentences. As she confidently reiterated her proud authorship, Shapiro coolly advised her to tightly hold on to that specific feeling of pride, ominously warning that they would critically need it in approximately 4 minutes. Without a single trace of performative drama, Shapiro casually picked up the very first folder with the mundane ease of a patron lifting a discarded receipt off a diner counter, and as the entire room watched this quiet action, the sheer anticipation built a suffocating atmospheric pressure that no amount of loud shouting could have ever generated. He initiated the engagement by stating he was starting with an allegedly easy, strictly factual matter to firmly establish a baseline consensus on reality before venturing into the more complex, difficult territories. Reading verbatim from the transcript, he transported the room back to the 23rd of March 2019. Specifically quoting her address at a high-profile banquet for the advocacy organization CARE, explicitly emphasizing his exact quotation to preemptively block any future accusations of deceptive editing or malicious trimming. He recited her claim that the organization was founded in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 due to the recognition that some people did something, before immediately looking up from the page to casually expose 2 massive, undeniable flaws in her assertion, categorizing them by size. Addressing the smaller factual error first, he ruthlessly corrected the historical record, pointing out that CARE was actually founded in 1994, a full 7 years prior to the September 11th attacks, meaning the foundational, factual clause of her speech containing a hard date was simply and demonstrably false. He painted a vivid picture of her standing confidently in front of a crowded banquet hall, authoritatively lecturing the audience about an organization supposedly born out of a devastating national tragedy that, according to the actual calendar, had not even occurred yet. The Congresswoman quickly attempted to brush this off, dismissively labeling it a minor, irrelevant point regarding a complex organizational timeline that supposedly did nothing to alter the broader substance of her argument. Shapiro agreed with lightning speed, his tone almost alarmingly cheerful as he accepted her concession, explaining that acknowledging this minor error achieved something devastatingly significant for his overarching case. Her flippant concession firmly established on the official congressional record that she was absolutely capable of stating glaring, objective falsehoods with total, unwavering confidence into a live microphone. He highlighted the profound contradiction. She had just proudly claimed she never poll, tested her statements, and authored her words plainly, yet he had effortlessly proven in the opening 90 seconds of their exchange that her profound confidence was entirely uncoupled from factual reality. By meticulously laying this psychological trap, Shapiro permanently stripped her of the ability to later hide behind the convenient excuse of misinterpretation or accidental misstatement when they inevitably reached the heavier, far more damning controversies lurking in his files. Sensing the walls rapidly closing in, the Congresswoman aggressively accused the conservative commentator of playing a clever, fast, and remarkably ugly little word game, attempting to dismiss his methodical interrogation as nothing more than a cheap parlor trick. Shapiro's rhythm did not break for even a fraction of a comma as he countered that he was not playing a game, but rather executing a precise analytical method designed to expose a deeply entrenched, highly revealing behavioral pattern. He relentlessly pivoted to her notorious history of deploying strategic vagueness precisely at the exact moments when linguistic precision would carry a heavy political cost, specifically bringing up the October 2019 House vote regarding the formal recognition of the Armenian genocide, a historical atrocity where 1.5 million human beings were systematically murdered. He highlighted the stark reality of the legislative process, emphasizing that the vote required a simple, binary moral choice, either a yes acknowledging the genocide occurred or a no denying it. Yet, out of all the elected representatives occupying that historic chamber, she deliberately chose to vote present, the absolute most non-committal, legally blurry word permitted by parliamentary rules, allowing a member to technically exist in the room without actually taking a definitive moral stance. Peering sharply over his meticulously organized documents, Shapiro pointed out a highly disturbing thematic pattern. Whenever a genocide is comfortably distant and publicly naming it is politically free, she positions herself as the loudest, most righteous voice in the entire capital. However, the very second that acknowledging historical reality might cost her a fragile political coalition or cost her a moment of thunderous applause at a fundraising banquet, the supposedly most fluent, articulate woman in Congress suddenly, conveniently reaches for the vaguest, most cowardly words available on the shelf. When she defensively retorted that her non-committal vote was a highly principled stance aimed at preventing genocide recognition from being weaponized as a political cudgel, Shapiro instantly dismantled the excuse, asserting that her actions are always conveniently framed as principled when politically advantageous and rapidly dismissed as theater when they are not, assuring her that he had already thoroughly read and cataloged her official defensive statements inside his ever-expanding folders. Then, the atmosphere shifted entirely. The vast hearing room went completely quiet in that very specific, highly unsettling manner that crowds do when they collectively sense the very floor beneath them begin to violently shift. It was time for the main event, the centerpiece of his interrogation, returning squarely to the exact same sentence from the exact same banquet delivered by the exact same proud author. Beyond the factual inaccuracies regarding timelines, Shapiro zeroed in on something far more sinister, her deliberate, calculated description of the horrific, premeditated murder of 2,977 innocent individuals as merely some people did something. Setting the page down and squaring it against the table's edge with two steady fingers, he starkly contrasted her aggressively dismissive phrasing with the brutal, unvarnished reality of the September 11th attack. He invoked the horrifying image of 19 radicalized hijackers, sworn members of Al-Qaeda, violently flying commercial airliners directly into towering skyscrapers packed with everyday citizens, secretaries, brave firefighters, and innocent civilians who had just arrived at their office desks with their morning coffee. He emphasized the sheer scale of the atrocity, the cold-blooded murder of almost 3,000 human beings on a beautiful Tuesday morning, right on American soil, constituting the single worst, most devastating attack on the nation since Pearl Harbor. He marveled out loud at how a sitting member of the United States Congress Someone entrusted with serving on the prestigious Foreign Affairs Committee could reach into the vast, expansive vocabulary of the entire English language and somehow emerge holding only those three pathetically inadequate words. Some people did something. Her voice sharpened with a highly defensive edge as she frantically attempted to recontextualize the quote, arguing that she was broadly speaking about the severe violations of Muslim American civil liberties following the attacks. An issue she bitterly complained the committee had never bothered to hold a hearing about, and angrily accused Shapiro of employing deceptive, bad-faith clipping tactics akin to a sensationalist New York Post headline. Shapiro calmly tapped the thick, unopened folder that had been sitting ominously on the table for 20 minutes, confidently declaring he possessed the entire, unedited 20-minute speech and offering to read any specific portion of it onto the official congressional record right then and there. He decisively cut through her obfuscation, declaring that the absolute accuracy of the shortened clip was not the core issue, nor was he deliberately extracting three isolated words out of a broader sentence that magically redeemed them. Rather, the full sentence itself offered zero redemption. The full 20-minute context actually made her choice of phrasing significantly worse, because it proved she had ample time and limitless rhetorical runway, yet actively decided that the single most appropriate descriptor for the most traumatic day in modern American history was the dismissive word something, a catastrophic linguistic choice she had never once attempted to correct or improve upon in the subsequent 6 years. Letting that heavy realization sit suspended in the air for exactly one agonizing second, Shapiro locked eyes with the Congresswoman and demanded a strict, uncompromising yes or no answer to a brutally direct question. Did she intrinsically know, at the exact moment she uttered the phrase, "some people," that those specific individuals were in fact 19 dedicated members of the Al-Qaeda terrorist network? When she angrily snapped back that it was a deeply offensive question and that obviously she knew who carried out the attacks, Shapiro's voice sped up a tactical acceleration that served as its own intense form of rising volume proclaiming good. Then it was a choice. He forcefully argued that her profound vagueness was not born of ignorance, but of malicious, calculated intent. She deployed those three blurry words because they served the highly specific, politically charged argument she was making in that banquet hall far better than the heavy, devastating truth ever could. The truth carries immense, paralyzing weight. The truth forces a rowdy room to sit still in somber reflection. And Shapiro exposed that she absolutely did not want that specific room to sit still. She wanted her audience fired up, angry, and mobilized. And to achieve that self-serving goal, she callously took the heaviest, most agonizing event that has ever shattered the country and purposefully made it light, simply because treating 9/11 lightly was politically useful to her in that exact moment. A deliberate tactic that was not a mere misquote, but a glaring, undeniable psychological tell. Feeling the terrifying momentum building against her, the Congresswoman instinctively reverted to the deeply ingrained defensive mechanism she always deployed whenever the political ground violently shifted beneath her feet. She attempted to entirely change the fundamental nature of the fight. Her voice dramatically rose, quickly finding its old, reliable strength as she retreated into the comforting, impenetrable fortress of manufactured outrage. She passionately painted herself as the ultimate intersectional victim, a Muslim woman, a refugee, and a black woman sitting in a congressional chair, supposedly being subjected to extraordinary cruelty by a privileged man who she claimed built a lucrative career entirely on being vicious. She fiercely argued that no white Christian male would ever be subjected to such an intense, unforgiving tribunal for simply uttering a single clumsy phrase, attempting to rebrand the entire official hearing as nothing more than an inherently bigoted, Islamophobic ritual designed to invalidate her genuine grief and criminalize her mere existence. For a fleeting, highly consequential moment, her practiced emotional appeal worked. It was a clean, flawlessly executed political punch that carried the immense muscle memory of having successfully landed in 100 similar rooms before. The atmosphere in the gallery visibly swayed in her favor. Diligent staffers nodded emphatically in solidarity. Pens scribbled furiously, and a previously stoic woman seated near the front row cast her eyes downward in apparent shame. The Congresswoman had successfully summoned the old, reliable reflex that courses through the veins of modern American discourse. the deeply conditioned, trained flinch of individuals instantly stepping back in terror from the devastating accusation of bigotry rather than bravely interrogating the underlying fact. She held total control of the room's momentum for approximately 20 seconds, but then the entire dynamic fractured, and the catalyst for this monumental shift was not Ben Shapiro at all. Deep in the third row of the crowded public gallery, an older gentleman wearing a plain, unadorned dark jacket slowly rose to his feet. He was completely uncredentialed, not on any official schedule, and possessed the deliberate, aching slowness of a man whose knees carried the heavy burden of a lifetime of hard-earned opinions. A federal marshal immediately moved to intercept the unauthorized disruption, but abruptly halted his advance when the committee chairman, watching the raw human drama unfold, subtly lifted his hand a mere half-inch off the polished wood, silently granting the grieving citizen the floor. The older man spoke in a remarkably steady, unamplified voice that required no excessive volume because the vast chamber had suddenly plummeted into the kind of absolute, reverent silence where a whisper sounds like thunder. He simply stated that his mother's name was Frances. She was 76 years old, and she was trapped inside the North Tower on that terrible morning. He revealed that he has stood at ground zero and read her name out loud every single year for over 2 decades, and painfully noted that during the specific year, the Congresswoman callously uttered her 3 vague words. He had them printed on a shirt and wore it to the solemn ceremony. He wanted her to viscerally understand exactly what her dismissive phrasing sounded like to the shattered families who had permanently lost somebody they loved, to the horrific something she so casually referenced. The sheer, agonizing steadiness of his grief fundamentally dismantled the room's defensive posture. He explicitly stated he was not a powerful senator, nor a highly paid pundit armed with extensive folders, but merely a devastated son who had waited 6 excruciating years to finally be in the same room with the Congresswoman and a live microphone. Taking it upon himself to answer the critical question she had cowardly dodged, the grieving son declared with absolute moral clarity that there is zero confusion about who did what to whom. The victims' families know the exact names of the hijackers, the precise flight numbers, the specific towers, the exact floors, and the very minute their loved ones were vaporized. Looking directly into her eyes, he delivered a crushing indictment, stating that she is the absolute only person in the entire United States who fundamentally required the details of that massacre to remain vague, because vague was the only possible version of reality she could sell at a partisan banquet to solicit cheap applause. Holding her gaze for one final, devastating second, he sternly commanded her to stop desperately reaching for the inflammatory word Islamophobia as a cheap shield to run away from the memory of his murdered mother. He powerfully validated that while actual anti-Muslim bigotry is a very real, dangerous phenomenon, she had just disgracefully spent that profound accusation to selfishly dodge accountability for disrespecting a dead woman, warning her that such cynical exploitation actively diminishes the weight of the word for every marginalized person who might legitimately need it for their own real-world protection. As the man slowly sat back down in the gallery, the deeply conditioned, trained flinch of white liberal guilt instantly evaporated from the room, replaced by something infinitely worse for the embattled Congresswoman: absolute, undeniable permission. The woman in the front row who had previously looked down in shame snapped her head right back up, and the powerful political current did not merely stall. It violently reversed course entirely. An ordinary man in the third row had just publicly commanded the most quoted, fiercely protected progressive woman in the United States Congress to put the deceptive race card down, because she was disgracefully spending its cultural currency on the grave of his murdered mother, demanding a return to hard, uncomfortable truths. Recognizing that the stunned room was now effortlessly executing his tactical objective for him, Shapiro uncharacteristically allowed the heavy silence to breathe for a moment, letting the son's agonizing rebuke sink deeply into the historical record before pressing his advantage. When he finally broke the quiet, he adopted a surprisingly measured tone, acknowledging the universal human reality that everyone occasionally stumbles over their own word. He freely admitted to his own past public embarrassments, referencing a notoriously botched live television election prediction that his critics still gleefully replay, explicitly stating that if the Congresswoman's quote was merely one isolated, terrible sentence, he would gladly close his folder and walk away, uninterested in ending a long political career over a single ugly line. Placing his hand firmly atop the thickest folder, his voice hardened once more as he declared the devastating truth. It was never just one isolated line. It was a highly calculated, deeply cynical methodology, and the American public had fundamentally earned the right to see her entire deceptive playbook laid bare, chronologically ordered, with the exact dates attached. Opening his second dossier, Shapiro brutally exposed the stark discrepancy between what her time-stamped online publications revealed and what her polished public speeches attempted to hide. He outlined her predictable, cowardly cycle. She consistently delivers the most inflammatory, radical statement a specific room desperately wants to hear, waits for the explosive clip to inevitably go viral, watches in silence as her own political party erupts in sheer panic, and then quietly issues a heavily sterilized clarification that asserts the exact polar opposite of her original explosive claim. She executes both conflicting maneuvers with the exact same unyielding confidence, heavily relying on the cynical assumption that the general public's memory is simply too incredibly short and distracted to ever keep track of both entirely contradictory statements. Pulling out a carefully stapled pair of printed pages, Shapiro triumphantly declared himself a meticulous, professional both-keeper, noting that holding politicians accountable to reality was the core function of his entire career. Reading directly from a 2021 document, he quoted her explosive written assertion that the world had witnessed unthinkable atrocities committed by the U.S., Hamas, Israel, Afghanistan, and the Taliban, sharply pointing out that she had deliberately placed the United States of America on the exact same moral plane as internationally recognized terrorist organizations that routinely execute men by throwing them off tall buildings and shoot innocent young girls simply for daring to attend school. He painted a vivid picture of her casually setting America down in a rhetorical police lineup next to barbaric zealots, accused of the exact same heinous crime. Laying that first damning page flat on the table, he immediately presented the second, detailing the intense, frantic backlash she quickly received from 11 Democrats within her own caucus. This fierce internal pressure forced her to rapidly issue a second, highly defensive statement where she suddenly claimed she was in no way equating terrorist organizations with democratic countries with well-established judicial systems. Squaring the two diametrically opposed pages edge to edge, Shapiro accelerated his cadence into a relentless, inescapable drumbeat, highlighting the sheer absurdity of the situation. Page 1 vehemently convicted America of standing shoulder to shoulder with the Taliban, while Page 2 vehemently denied she would ever dare compare America to a terrorist group. He noted the profound hypocrisy that both completely irreconcilable statements originated from the exact same verified account during the exact same week, explicitly authored by the exact same proud, self-proclaimed meticulous wordsmith. Shapiro masterfully landed the final blow, declaring that he wouldn't even bother asking her which of the two statements she genuinely believed in her heart, because the undeniable truth was that she fundamentally believed neither. She only ever believed in feeding whichever specific room was standing directly in front of her, exactly what they hungered to hear. The first room demanded a guilty, blood-soaked America, and the second room, controlled by her panicked party leadership, demanded an innocent one, and she cynically catered to both, banking entirely on the exhaustion of the American electorate to never staple her lies together. When she desperately attempted to deploy a sophisticated $5 academic phrase, arguing that he was promoting a gross and deliberate distortion of a nuanced foreign policy position about accountability under international law, Shapiro instantly cut her off, flatly stating it was not a distortion, but a literal, time-stamped screenshot captured at 3:24 inches the afternoon. He coldly reminded her that he didn't write the damning words, she did. He simply refused to let them be conveniently lost to the digital ether. In response to this inescapable trap, the solemn congressional room broke, not with a polite titter, but with a real, rolling, utterly helpless wave of laughter, the devastating kind of deep, communal laughter that physically overtakes a crowd and brutally refuses to give control back. It was the sound of an audience laughing not just at the absurdity of her blatant hypocrisy, but at each other for finally seeing through the facade, as a man near the front desperately removed his glasses to wipe away tears of mirth, and a seasoned reporter in the second row physically bit down on his own lip on camera to stop his trembling shoulders. Yet, amidst the roaring humiliation, the grieving son in the third row remained deadly silent, watching the desperately squirming Congresswoman with a profound, unmoving stillness that carried significantly more crushing weight than every single mocking laugh echoing throughout the chamber. She was publicly exposed, hopelessly gaslighting the public by apologizing for an action, while simultaneously refusing to apologize for it on the exact same afternoon, all under her own verified name, completely undone by a prepared man with a simple cardboard folder who simply bothered to keep both halves of the story. Backed into an inescapable corner, the Congresswoman fought back one final time, and to her credit, she swung harder than she had all day, refusing to simply fade quietly into the annals of political defeat. Yanking the heavy microphone aggressively closer to her mouth, she unleashed a low, remarkably fast, and genuinely furious defense of her entire political existence. She ferociously challenged Shapiro to examine her actual legislative record, passionately citing bills she passed that put food directly into the mouths of impoverished children, while dismissive men like him supposedly wrote elitist columns, arguing why those very children did not deserve to eat. Tapping into the raw, powerful narrative of her lived experience, she fiercely reminded the room that she arrived in this country with absolutely nothing, surviving the brutal deprivations of a refugee camp, painstakingly learning a foreign language, earning her American citizenship, and repeatedly winning highly contested elections in a district that continuously chooses to empower her. Her voice trembled with righteous indignation as she accused Shapiro of attempting to lazily reduce a complex, triumphant human life into a cheap stack of cherry-picked papers printed out that very morning, simply to generate viral video content for a detached audience that would never bother to truly know her name or understand her struggles. Declaring her inherent dignity as a duly elected United States Congresswoman, she vehemently vowed that she would never allow herself to be reduced to mere digital content. For a fleeting moment, the defense was genuinely potent. A fraction of the raw political heat miraculously returned to her side, and the furious scribbling of several reporters' pens hesitated. Shapiro wisely allowed her to exhaust her entire emotional payload, letting the heavy resonance of her personal history fully land before he clinically, ruthlessly removed the gloves once and for all. He executed this final maneuver not by aggressively raising his voice, but by paradoxically slowing his cadence down to an excruciating, hyper-focused crawl. He respectfully conceded her incredible life story, openly stating that he would gladly acknowledge across any table in America that she built a remarkable life from absolute nothing, firmly asserting that nobody was attempting to reduce or invalidate her extraordinary personal journey. However, he instantly pivoted back to the fatal trap she had set for herself 40 minutes prior, placing one firm index finger on her first contradictor. He weaponized her own arrogant admissions against her, reminding the room that she proudly declared herself to be a precise, deliberate author of her own words, completely incapable of carelessness. He demanded she stop desperately lying to crowded rooms by claiming she was maliciously misunderstood. The devastating, inescapable reality was that she was, in fact, understood perfectly. Every single time she sparked a national outrage, she was understood with absolute, crystal-clear perfection by the very citizens who accurately quoted her own words back to her verbatim, and her only defense mechanism was to viciously smear those ordinary citizens as raving bigots simply for possessing the basic reading comprehension required to understand her. Holding her gaze with icy intensity, he delivered the definitive psychological kill shot. She never misspoke. She purposefully chose all three of those horrific words regarding 9/11, just as she always calculated every inflammatory syllable she ever uttered. Nobody in the gallery laughed at that brutal assessment. The heavy truth sank down into the deepest, most serious foundational layer of the room, the invisible place where permanent, career-altering judgments are quietly finalized. Desperate to reclaim the narrative, the Congresswoman instinctively reached for the singular, trusty tool that had always magically saved her in every hostile environment she had ever faced: her voice. She opened her mouth to execute the fast pivot, the clever reframe, the rapid-fire defensive sentence designed to violently shift the floor back under her feet, the signature, practiced maneuver that had quite literally never once failed her in her entire professional life. But absolutely nothing came out. She managed only a sharp, ragged breath, a highly audible intake clearly captured on the hypersensitive live microphone, signifying the frantic, desperate start of a word that simply refused to arrive. Panicking internally, She frantically mentally reached for another angle, desperately searching for one of the three alternative defensive strategies she always kept loaded in the chamber, but that cognitive pathway was equally, horrifyingly empty. Her mouth hung slightly agape. The vast hearing room plunged into an agonizing, suffocating silence, and the relentless, rhythmic ticking of the analog clock mounted high on the back wall suddenly transformed into the absolute loudest, most deafening sound in the entire Capitol building. 1 second passed. 2 seconds. The most remarkably fluent, hyper-verbal woman in the history of the United States Congress, the one politician who fundamentally never, ever ran out of words, had completely, thoroughly run out. 3 seconds. 4 seconds. 5. She awkwardly closed her mouth, only to helplessly open it once again, her trembling hand aimlessly wandering across the smooth wooden table, as if desperately searching for an invisible script that simply did not exist. High up in the tense gallery, a wooden chair loudly creaked, the sudden noise echoing like a violent gunshot in the dead air. A cell phone violently buzzed against a hard wooden railing, and absolutely nobody dared move to silence it. 6 seconds. 7 seconds. And the absolute worst, most agonizing part of the entire ordeal for her, the specific traumatic detail she would helplessly replay in her mind for weeks on end, was that Ben Shapiro deliberately refused to fill the torturous void. He did not eagerly jump in to finish her off, he did not arrogantly deliver one final, crushing punchline, and he completely refused to do the very thing every other political opponent had always predictably done: offer her a fresh rhetorical target to push back against. He just let the agonizing silence endlessly run, forcing every single terrified person in that vast room to involuntarily count the agonizing seconds along with the ticking clock, deeply aware that while an aggressively talking Ilhan Omar was a deeply familiar, recognized fixture in American politics, a completely silent, thoroughly broken Ilhan Omar was a phenomenon literally nobody had ever witnessed before. The television cameras locked onto her frozen features, the unblinking red recording lights holding steady, because the veteran camera operators intrinsically understood long before the live audience did that this horrifying, cavernous absence of sound, the absolute nothingness, was the real, historic story. 8 seconds. 9 seconds. Finally, moving with the extreme, fragile caution of a person setting down a highly volatile, explosive device they no longer remotely trust, she slowly placed both hands perfectly flat against the polished table. Her voice, completely stripped of all its trademark speed, arrogant confidence, and combative heat, echoed weakly into the microphone as she surrendered. "I have nothing further for this man." It was universally recognized as the absolute first and only genuinely true sentence she had uttered the entire day, and the devastating silence from the single person in American politics who was supposedly never, ever supposed to be quiet permanently etched, the unmistakable sound of a political career violently changing shape on live television. The moment the gavel fell, the hearing ended, but the catastrophic digital shockwave of 9 seconds was just beginning to detonate across America. Within hours, all partisan warfare over foreign policy and civil liberties completely evaporated, replaced by a unified, morbid fascination as the nation watched a relentlessly vocal politician horrifyingly discover on live television that her words had permanently abandoned her. The devastating still frame her mouth agape, eyes cast down, hands flat against the ticking clock dominated every evening broadcast. While morning hosts stared silently into cameras and late-night comedians failed to fill the agonizing void, proving to silent classrooms and stunned viewers alike that 9 seconds of utter emptiness is an absolute eternity. In the hushed Capitol corridors, a nervous Democratic ally whispered the chilling reality. While the party had spent years desperately stapling her fractured sentences together, it is fundamentally impossible to staple silence, and her invincible aura of fear had permanently vanished. Miles away, driving home through the dark New Jersey night, the grieving son who broke her finally wept, not in sorrow, but in the profound, overwhelming release of a man who had successfully restored his murdered mother's memory into a tangible reality, stripping away all vague political obfuscation. Meanwhile, Ben Shapiro simply squared his folders and briskly vanished past the flashing cameras without a single victory lap, having clinically proven that in the ruthless theater of Washington, the absolute heaviest, most lethal weapon is a ticking clock. If witnessing untouchable political arrogance, violently dismantled by an ordinary citizen's raw truth made you sit up in your chair, make your voice heard by hitting the like button, subscribing to the channel, and dropping the word 9 in the comments below. Because while the loudest thing in that room was a powerful politician running out of words, the haunting reality is that this deafening silence is merely the calm before the storm, as the political establishment scrambles in sheer panic. One terrifying, unanswerable question remains hanging over the fractured capital. When a deeply wounded political survivor who has never once accepted defeat is publicly humiliated on a national stage, what unprecedented, desperate retaliation will she ruthlessly unleash when she finally finds her voice again?